It was the summer of 2003 when 27-year-old Cecily Brandt first understood what it meant to be surrounded and not yet beaten. The notice came on a Wednesday. Not a phone call, not a knock at the door. A notice, folded into thirds, tucked between a seed catalog and an electric bill in the old tin mailbox. Her grandmother Dorothea had painted barn red back in 1971. The mailbox still wore that same faded red, the paint cracked along the seams like dried riverbed. Cecily stood at the end of the gravel lane and read the letter twice. Then she folded it back along its creases, slid it into the pocket of her work jeans, and went to feed the trout. That was her way. You absorbed the blow first. Then you moved. Let me tell you what that farm was, before I tell you what nearly happened to it. Because you cannot understand what Cecily fought for unless you understand what she was fighting to keep. The Brandt property sat on 43 acres of glacial moraine land in the hill country of central Wisconsin, the kind of land that geologists call beautiful and farmers call difficult. The soil was sandy and quick draining in the upland fields, but at the back of the property, fed by an underground spring, her grandmother had located with a willow branch and sheer stubbornness there was a pond. 3.5 acres of cold, clear water that never rose above 62 degrees, even in August. Dorothea had dug it in 1968 with a borrowed excavator and the help of 2 neighboring families. She had stocked it with brook trout and brown trout, and she had spent the next 35 years learning every variable that made those fish taste the way they did. Because they tasted like nothing else. That was the thing. That was what the food writers would eventually say, reaching for words and mostly falling short. There was a cleanness to a Brandt trout, a mineral brightness that came from the cold spring water, and beneath that something herbaceous, almost botanical, that came from the aquatic plants Dorothea had cultivated along the pond margins. Watercress, wild mint, a particular variety of stonewort that she transplanted from a stream 2 counties over. She called it her recipe. She never wrote it down. When Dorothea died in the spring of 2001, she left the farm to Cecily, her only granddaughter, who had spent every summer of her childhood here, and who was, of all the people Dorothea knew, the only one who understood that the pond was not a hobby. It was a system. It was a living, interdependent thing that had taken decades to calibrate, and it would take decades more to fully understand. Cecily had been teaching 8th grade science in Madison at the time of the inheritance. She resigned her position, loaded her truck, and moved back to the farm before the school year even ended. Her colleagues thought she'd had a breakdown. Her mother thought she was throwing her life away. Cecily thought she was finally starting it. The skeptics in the nearest town, a small place called Millhaven, about 4 miles east along a county road, saw a young woman playing at farming. They were not unkind about it. It was a gentle, pitying kind of skepticism, the kind that comes from people who have watched too many young idealists move to the country and leave again when the winters get long. Marlene at the grain co-op would ask after her in a voice that made every question sound like condolences. Still out there at the Brandt place? As though the farm were a hospice and Cecily, a visiting relative who simply hadn't accepted the prognosis yet. Cecily sold trout at the Saturday market in Millhaven and to 2 restaurants in the next county over. She grew her own feed additives in a half-acre kitchen garden. Duckweed, comfrey, black soldier fly larvae raised in a wooden bin her grandmother had built. She sold the trout whole or filleted to order in waxed paper. She had 32 regular customers who drove to the farm directly, people who had been buying from Dorothea and who transferred their loyalty to Cecily as naturally as water finds a new channel when the old one shifts. It was not a comfortable income, but the land was paid for and the pond needed no mortgage. Cecily lived in the way her grandmother had taught her. Carefully, seasonally, without waste. The farm fed her more than money could. That was what was in the balance when she unfolded that notice. The North Water Resort and Recreation Company had purchased the 260 acres of old dairy ground that bordered her property to the north and east. They were planning, the letter explained in its cheerful corporate language, a premier lakeside recreation destination, a boutique hotel with 42 rooms, a fine dining restaurant, and a private lake to be constructed in the lowland meadow that ran along her northern fence line. The new lake, they noted with the breezy confidence of people who have never actually tried to keep a body of water alive, would offer guests kayaking, paddleboarding, and guided fishing experiences. They looked forward to being good neighbors. Cecily knew what a construction lake looked like. She knew what runoff from that kind of earthwork would do to her pond's chemistry. She knew what the fuel and solvents and concrete wash water from a 2-year construction project would introduce into the groundwater that fed her spring. She knew these things not because she'd studied them in books, though she had, but because she'd watched her grandmother spend a lifetime managing the precise conditions that made the pond what it was. One bad year of contaminated inflow could shift the pH past the trout's tolerance. 2 bad years could eliminate the stonewort entirely, and without the stonewort and the cold water plant system Dorothea had built, the trout would taste like every other trout, and if they tasted like every other trout, there was no farm. There was just a woman with a pond. Now let me tell you about the man who came to explain this to her, as though she hadn't already understood it better than he ever could. Mr. Douglas Fenner arrived 3 weeks after the letter. He drove a white SUV with the Northwater logo on the door, an art-directed silhouette of a heron over water, the kind of logo that costs more to design than most people's monthly income. He was perhaps 50, with silver hair combed back from a broad, photogenic face, and the kind of tailored outdoor wear that was meant to say, "I respect the land," while also making very clear that he had never actually worked on it. He did not come to the door. He stood in the lane with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the farm with the patient, assessing expression of a man doing a mental appraisal. Cecily came out from the pond shed, her waders still on, her hands smelling of creek and fish. "Miss Brant?" he said, smiling. "Doug Fenner, VP of Development, Northwater. I wanted to introduce myself personally and talk through what we're planning." He said it the way you'd describe a pleasant surprise you were about to give someone. Cecily pulled off one glove. "I got the letter," she said. "Then you know we're going to be neighbors." He smiled wider, as though this were good news she hadn't processed yet. "I want you to know that we're committed to responsible development. We've done extensive environmental review. Your runoff corridor runs directly into the wetland margin on my north fence," Cecily said. "That wetland connects to the spring that feeds my pond. Your construction phase will introduce sediment, petroleum products, and concrete alkalinity into water that currently runs at a pH of 7.2. My trout have a tolerance window of 6.8 to 7.6. I have no buffer." Mr. Fenner looked at her the way people look at someone who has said something in a foreign language. He recovered quickly. "Well, we have engineers who manage those concerns, and I'm sure we can." "I'm not finished," Cecily said. Her voice was not raised. It had that flat, factual quality of someone who has already run the numbers and is now simply reporting results. "Beyond the construction phase, your recreation lake will introduce motorized watercraft noise at close range. Brown trout are lateral line sensitive. Chronic vibration stress suppresses their feeding response and immune function. I will lose production. I may lose stock." He paused. Then he produced the offer. It was thorough, well-structured, and substantial. Northwater would pay her assessed value plus 30%. She could have a new start somewhere else. Somewhere, he said with a careful smile with better infrastructure. Cecily looked at the number on the paper. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she handed it back. The farm is not for sale, Mr. Fenner. He put the paper away with the controlled patience of a man who was accustomed to initial refusals. Miss Brandt, I want to be straight with you. This project is happening. The permits are filed. The groundbreaking is in October. We'd like to have a cooperative relationship with adjacent landowners, but, he paused, selecting his words, the scale of what we're doing may make your current operation difficult to sustain. I understand, Cecily said. The farm is not for sale. He left. The Heron logo on the SUV door disappeared around the bend in the lane, and Cecily stood in the gravel and listened to the silence come back. Then she went inside to her grandmother's study. Dorothea Brandt had not been a woman who threw things away. The study was a narrow room off the kitchen, its walls lined floor to ceiling with shelves that held a 50-year record of everything. Water testing logs in spiral notebooks, breeding journals for the trout stock, hand-drawn diagrams of the pond's stratification layers in different seasons, folders of correspondence with university extension offices and fisheries biologists, a box of photographs labeled in her grandmother's looping hand. Cecily had spent 2 years since inheriting the farm learning to read these records the way you learn a language. Slowly at first, then with increasing fluency, until the patterns began to speak. She knew what she was looking for. She had seen it referenced in the water logs twice, in entries from 1979 and again from 1983, when a neighboring farmer had briefly diverted a drainage ditch and affected the spring flow. She found it in a manila folder labeled BFO Strategy, tucked between a fisheries bulletin from 1981 and a hand-drawn map of the property's drainage network. Inside were 12 pages of her grandmother's notes, written in the careful, unhurried script of someone thinking on paper. The problem Dorothea had faced was different in scale but identical in kind, an external pressure threatening to alter the water chemistry of the pond. Her solution had not been legal or confrontational. It had been biological. Dense plantings of native wetland species along the entire northern and eastern margins, cattail, sedge, boneset, Joe Pye weed, native willow, a living filtration system that would intercept and process runoff before it reached the spring intake. Dorothea had sketched the species layout in careful layers, the tall emergent plants at the outer edge, the lower sedge meadow behind them, and closest to the spring, a dense planting of watercress and blue flag iris that would act as chemical indicators. If the water quality changed, these plants would show it first before the trout did. She had never needed to build it. The drainage ditch problem had resolved itself when the neighbor sold his land. But she had planned for it, designed it, costed it, and left it in a folder for whoever came after her. She had known, in the way that people who love a place deeply always seem to know, that this problem would come eventually. She had just not known when or in what form. Now Cecily knew. That fall, before the first Northwater bulldozer turned a wheel, she began planting. She spent what remained of her operating reserves on bare root wetland stock from a native plant nursery 3 hours south. She worked with a retired county conservationist named Walt Oberg, a quiet man in his 70s who had known her grandmother, and who, when Cecily explained what she was trying to do, put on his wading boots and did not ask for payment. Together they staked out the buffer margin, dug the installation trenches by hand along the fence line, and set 1,100 plants in the ground before the soil froze. The Millhaven consensus was not kind. Word traveled the way it does in small rural communities, efficiently and slightly distorted. People heard that the Brandt girl was spending her savings to plant weeds along a fence. They shook their heads. There was a developer with lawyers and engineers and a permit from the county, and this young woman's plan was to plant cattails. It was, in the general view, a measure of how far gone she really was. Construction began in October, exactly as Mr. Fenner had promised. The noise was the first thing, the low, bone-deep percussion of heavy equipment that started before full light and continued past dusk. Cecily felt it in the floor of the farmhouse before she heard it. The pond took the vibration differently than she did. She watched the trout change their patterns, moving away from the north margin, crowding toward the spring intake. Their feeding slowed. She increased the duckweed supply, adjusted the aeration, did everything she could to reduce their stress load. The water quality tests she ran every 2 weeks told a more complicated story. The pH held through the first winter, then dropped incrementally the following spring when snowmelt carried construction sediment through the drainage corridor. Not enough to harm the trout, just enough to worry her. She added crushed limestone to 3 locations along the spring channel. She watched. She adjusted. She tested again. There was a night in February of the second construction year when she thought she might be losing. She had pulled the water samples that afternoon and found the first trace of petroleum-based compound she'd detected since the project began. A faint, oily iridescence at the surface of the north margin sampling point. Small enough that it might have been misread, large enough that it wasn't. She sat at the kitchen table with the sample jars lined up in front of her and her grandmother's water logs open beside them, and she felt, for the first time since Mr. Fenner's visit, a kind of cold hollowness settle in. The trout were healthy. The stonewort was intact, but the margin was narrowing, and she was doing this alone. And the resort's main lodge was framed and roofed and lit from inside at night, with the busy yellow light of interior construction visible over the tree line from her bedroom window. It looked finished. It looked inevitable. The kind of thing that had already happened was still in the process of happening and could not be undone. She went to the shelf and pulled down one of her grandmother's water logs from 1974, the year after Dorothea had stocked the pond. For the first time, the year the spring had run low in August for the first time in anyone's memory. She read Dorothea's entry from that August in the handwriting she'd grown up seeing on grocery lists and birthday cards. Low flow continues. pH climbing. Lost 4 fish this week, adjusting lime ratio and deepening east channel tomorrow. I did not come this far to quit now. That was all. No anguish, no crisis. Just the next step, written down as though the only question was which one to take. Cecily closed the log. She went back to the sample jars. She identified the likely source of the compound, a temporary equipment staging area on the adjacent property, positioned upslope from a drainage channel that ran toward her fence line. She photographed the staging area from the fence, documented the drainage path, and sent a formal notice to the county's Environmental Compliance Office with her sample data attached. The response was slower than she would have liked, but the staging area was relocated within 3 weeks. The petroleum trace did not recur. By the time the Northwater Resort opened, 18 months later, in the late spring of what turned out to be a beautiful Wisconsin June, the buffer margin had done something Cecily had hoped for, but not fully expected. It had become an ecosystem. The willows had leafed out into a continuous screen that was now 5 feet tall in its tallest sections. Behind them, the sedge meadow had filled in so thickly that you could not see the fence from the road. Dragonflies worked the margins in clouds. Red-winged blackbirds nested in the cattails. The water quality logs showed that the spring intake chemistry had held within 0.2 of a pH point across the entire construction period. The stonewort was flowering. The trout were feeding well. The resort itself was, objectively beautiful. Cecily could see the roofline from the north edge of her property, the clean lines of timber and glass, the solar panels angled south on the outbuildings, the boardwalk that curved out over their artificial lake. On summer evenings, when the wind was from the north, she could occasionally hear music from their outdoor venue space, soft enough that it was more sensation than sound. She didn't mind it. She had held the line she needed to hold. The rest was just noise. The first sign that things were shifting came not from the resort, but from a woman named Gwen Archer, a food blogger based in Milwaukee, who had driven up for a weekend at Northwater and had, on the recommendation of a friend who'd heard of the farm, left the resort property on a Saturday morning and driven down the county road to Cecily's farm stand. Cecily's farm stand was 2 sawhorses and a plywood board under the oak tree at the end of the lane. There was a scale, a card reader on her phone, and a handwritten price list taped inside a plastic sleeve. She was not there when Gwen Archer arrived. She was at the pond, but she'd left things unlocked on the honor system, as she always did. Gwen Archer bought 2 pounds of whole trout and a bag of fresh watercress and left her card in the box with a note that said simply, "This is the best fish I have bought in years. Do you ship?" The piece she published 6 weeks later was not reviewed on a major magazine's website. It was on her own platform where she had 60,000 subscribers. She wrote about the trout the way people write about things that have restored their faith in something, simply without excessive adjectives, with the specificity that only comes from genuine experience. She wrote that the flesh had a coldness to it that didn't come from the refrigerator, but seemed native to the fish itself, a quality she had never encountered before. She wrote about the mineral brightness she'd tasted and the way the flavor changed as the fillet cooled on the plate. She wrote that she had eaten trout all her life, and this was the first time she had eaten trout that tasted, as she put it, like the specific place where it had lived. She mentioned in passing that the Brandt farm was located approximately a quarter mile from a very nice resort called Northwater, if anyone wanted to make a weekend of it. What happened next was gradual enough that Cecily almost didn't notice it forming, the way you don't notice fog building until you look up and the other side of the pond has disappeared. A few guests from Northwater began appearing at the farm stand on weekend mornings. Then more. Then, one Thursday afternoon in August, the resort's executive chef, a compact man named Mr. Elias, who wore his kitchen whites even on errands, which Cecily found oddly endearing, drove down the lane and knocked on her door. He introduced himself with a handshake that was businesslike, without being stiff. "I'll be direct," he said. "We have guests asking about your fish by name, not local trout. Your fish specifically, by farm name. We're getting 4 or 5 requests a week from guests who either had it at the stand or read the piece online. We have nothing to offer them. We're sourcing from a distributor in Green Bay, and it is." He paused, with the candor of someone who respects the person they're talking to, not the same product. Cecily offered him a cup of coffee and a chair on the porch. She listened while he described what Northwater was looking for: a regular supply of whole fish and fillets for the restaurant, and possibly some of the watercress for the kitchen garden menu. He was measured about quantities, more careful about logistics than she would have expected from a chef at that level. She revised her first impression upward. She told him she would think about it. She thought about it for 4 days, the way her grandmother had taught her. Walk the pond, check the water, count the stock, run the numbers against the season. By Thursday, she knew what she could supply without stressing the system. By Friday, she knew what she wanted to ask for. The meeting happened at her kitchen table, not at the resort. She had suggested this, gently, and Mr. Elias had agreed without apparent objection. She brought in her production records, her water logs, and a single page with her terms written out in the same clear hand she used for her price lists. She did not bring a lawyer. She did not need one for this conversation. What she needed was clarity, and she had it. She named her price per pound. It was not a wholesale price. It was her farm stand price, with a service charge for scheduled delivery added on top. She told them the quantity she could commit to, a fixed weekly number, seasonally adjusted, that she had calculated would let her maintain stock without overworking the pond. She told them she would not increase production to meet demand. Demand would have to meet her production. That was not a negotiating position. It was a biological fact, and Mr. Elias, to his credit, accepted it as one. Then she put the last page on the table. In exchange for the exclusivity she was offering Northwater, they would be her sole commercial restaurant client, and she would supply no other establishment as long as the contract held. She had one operational requirement. The Northwater Recreation Lake was separated from her property by a berm and approximately 140 yards of their own meadow. But the sound carried, specifically, the sound of the electric pontoon boats they were renting to guests carried, and the vibration from their kayak launch dock had already attracted a comment or two in her water logs. She produced a noise tolerance study from a Wisconsin DNR fisheries research paper she had pulled from the university library. She set it beside her terms sheet. She asked for a 200-foot quiet corridor along their shared fence line. No motorized watercraft within that margin. No amplified music from the East Terrace after 8 p.m. in writing, in the contract, with a quarterly review mechanism she could invoke if readings exceeded the established baseline. Mr. Elias read it. He was quiet for a moment. "I'll need to bring this to the ownership," he said. "I understand," Cecily said. She poured more coffee. "Take the time you need." It took 10 days. Mr. Fenner himself came down the lane for the second time, in the same white SUV, the same heron logo on the door. He was less assured this time. The ease was still there, the practiced manner. But beneath it was the particular look of a man who had gone back to his ownership group and found the conversation more complicated than he'd expected. It turned out that the piece in Gwen Archer's newsletter had been shared by a food editor at a Chicago magazine. The Chicago piece was being planned. Northwater's PR team had already identified the Brandt farm as an asset to the resort story, the authentic local producer, the historic family farm, the trout with the singular flavor. They were using her, Cecily noted to herself without bitterness, before they'd even signed anything. She let him talk. When he was finished, she slid the contract across the table. He read it with his own lawyer present this time, a young woman who made careful notes but raised no substantive objections. When he got to the quiet corridor clause, he looked up. "The motorized restriction is straightforward," he said. "The music provision," he paused, "is non-negotiable," Cecily said. She kept her voice even. "The East Terrace is 110 yards from my pond's eastern margin. Sound at that proximity at typical outdoor venue levels has a measurable effect on lateral line stress in the stock. I've got the data. Your lawyer can request a copy." He looked at her for a long moment. She thought she saw, just briefly, something other than calculation in his expression, something closer to recognition. He signed. Mr. Fenner signed, and Cecily dated the contract, and they shook hands across her kitchen table, and he said something about looking forward to a productive partnership, and she said she was sure it would be. And then he left, and she sat alone in the kitchen for a while, listening to the particular quality of the quiet on her side of the buffer margin, the willows moving, the birds and the cattails, the soft, continuous sound of cold water finding its level in the ground beneath her feet. She did not expand the farm. She had never planned to. The contract with North Water gave her a steady income that she applied carefully. A new water testing system, better aeration equipment for the pond, and 200 acres of adjacent woodland she purchased from the Oberg family when Walt retired and his children chose not to farm. She didn't develop the woodland. She enrolled it in a private land trust, added it to the property boundary, and planted white pine seedlings along the western edge, in the pattern her grandmother had sketched in a 1966 journal entry. The resort's marketing materials, within 2 years of the contract, featured the Brandt farm on their website. The phrasing was enthusiastic and slightly inaccurate in the way of marketing, but the essential story was there. The multi-generational trout farm, the spring-fed pond, the family recipe in the water. Guests booked stays specifically because of it. Northwater made more money from the story of the farm than Sicily made from supplying it, and she understood this, and it did not trouble her. She was not selling her story. She was selling fish. The difference mattered to her. Walt Oberg came by every month or so, that first year, ostensibly to help her monitor the buffer margin, really because he missed the work and liked the company. One evening in September, they were walking the northern fence line, checking the willow stakes, and he stopped at the corner post and looked north at the resort roofline, bright in the late afternoon light. "Your grandmother would have been pleased," he said. Cecily thought about that. "She would have found something else to worry about," she said. He laughed. "That's true. She always did." They stood there for a while in the kind of quiet that two people who have worked the same land share without needing to explain. The willows moved. The blackbirds argued in the cattails. The pond behind them was still and cold, and exactly the temperature it was supposed to be. Years later, when young farmers came to her, and they did come, more every season, people who had read about her or heard the name from an extension agent or a chef or a neighbor, she would walk them along the buffer margin the way Walt had walked it with her. She would show them the layers. The outer willow screen, the sedge meadow, the watercress beds at the spring intake. She would pull a plant and let them smell the roots. She would show them the water logs going back to 1968 in her grandmother's handwriting. "You're thinking about what you can build," she would tell them. Faster, bigger, more defensible. That's not a bad instinct. But the thing that protected this farm wasn't a wall. It was a system. 50 years of someone paying close enough attention to know exactly what this water needed. She would stop at the spring intake and let them look at where the water came out of the ground, cold and clear and tasting of the specific geology of this specific hill. "The pressure is always going to come," she said. "Someone will always want to build something next to what you love. You can't stop them. But you can understand your system well enough that you know exactly which point it cannot afford to lose, and then you protect that point with everything you have. Everything else can flex. That one thing can't." She handed each of them a copy of the waterlog methodology her grandmother had developed, printed from the original pages and stapled in the corner. She told them to start their own the same week they got home. None of them forgot her. Most of them came back. Cecily Brandt never sold the farm. She never expanded it beyond what the pond could sustainably produce. The trout tasted until the end like the spring they came from, cold and mineral and alive with the particular character of a place that had been loved carefully for a very long time. That was not an accident. It was the result of two women, a generation apart, making the same decision in the same kitchen, to stay, to listen, and to trust what the land already knew.